quote unquote, brick moon means better space habitats. Our unique perspective, grounded in the social sciences, and architectural design, allows us to ask different kinds of questions about your desired habitats and get useful answers. So cool. Tell us about, space architecture and like kind of taking that architectural I guess grounding as we've kind of discussed and what that means, but then also, doing that in space of an architect being an astronaut architect, if you will, and then Brick Moon Space, how did it come about, et cetera?
Yeah, Brick Moon is a great chance to again work with others. In this case, others are Justin Walsh and Alan Scharmen, aka Dr. Space Junk, who you
Yeah.
mentioned earlier, who's a terrific colleague. They're both terrific colleagues, and it's been cool to collaborate with them a little bit on their International Space Station archaeological
Oh,
project,
right.
which they've
Yeah.
been doing for a couple of years now,
Yep.
that produces all kinds of crazy results. And we actually just last year we were able to co-design an experiment that was carried out by actual astronauts doing active archaeology on the space station for
Oh,
the first
dope.
time.
Dope. Okay.
That was around this time last year. So coming out of that work, where I was able to collaborate a little bit with them, we had the chance to start talking with people who are designing things like space stations, next generation space habitats,
Yep.
and vehicles, the spaces that humans occupy. And what we started to find is that on the one hand, there's a lot of like there's not a lot of sort of integration of aspects of the human element that people steeped in archaeology and architecture can't ignore. Of course, there's a lot of data about how bodies, as bodies work, about bone loss and eyesight changes
Sure.
and things like that result from living in microgravity for a long period of time. It's super dangerous to
Yeah.
bodies, it turns out,
Yeah.
way more dangerous than anybody like Werner von Braun or people from the 50s ever suspected. But there's also questions about like, okay, well, how do people make culture together in a space, especially when they're coming from all kinds of different backgrounds?
Hmm.
Right? Everybody's coming from a culture when they go up there. It's an international space station. But also the space itself makes a culture, right? We make our spaces and our spaces make us. So they're producing culture while they're there. So besides the data and the engineering concerns, that are usually captured by the term human factors in these
Uh-huh.
conversations,
Yep.
there are all these cultural concerns too about how spaces make cultures and cultures make spaces. And what we wanted to be able to do was to do two things with Brick Moon, to be able to get away from the anecdote a little bit. A lot of the companies who design space habitats, they often have an advisor astronaut or advisor ex astronaut, on their board, or that they have on speed dial as a go-to
The
consultant.
clout is there. Yeah.
The cloud is there, but also the personal stories are there,
For
right?
sure.
What was the most difficult thing about living in space? What
Yeah,
was
yeah,
the
yeah.
most useful thing? What sort of opportunities do we have to improve next generation designs? It turns out when you ask for stories, you get a lot of stories, and that's a limited perspective that provides, especially if you're only talking to one or two astronauts.
Yeah.
With the International Space Station Archaeological Project, Justin and Alice have a lot of bigger picture data. It's the question of scale again. Who is actually using what space and when, and with who else in it? And so they can look at that over a 20-year window
Totally.
that isn't captured by a story from Paolo Nespoli or whoever the astronaut consultant is. So there's that, and there's also, I think, in terms of my own practice and my own relationship with Justin and Alice and with Brick Moon, I realized really early on, despite having designed a space habitat for manatees and chickens, that I didn't really want to be a space architect. Just like I realized, like, okay, all right, I've done that. I've built walls and swept floors and poured concrete. That's I've drawn structures at all scales that got built. I've done that. I understand what I need to understand about that. I don't really want to design space habitats,
Yeah.
for all the stuff I've read about. What I'm more interested in doing is being what I'm able to, be in these conversations, which is to be, someone who thinks a lot about the history and theory of something like space architecture or space
Totally.
urbanism. Which I found that a lot of people are designing these space habitats and they're doing a terrific job, and they have a lot of knowledge. Um, but they're not talking a whole lot about the bigger picture, the history and theory, which we talk about quite a lot in the spatial practice disciplines that I'm familiar with.
Yep.
So I hope to bring that conversation, again, to the forefront, to talk about the whys along with the hows, and of course the whats in terms of the production of space on a cultural level and on a social level, which I found that, and talking with Alice and Justin especially, archaeologists are also quite good at doing, and they have these they talk about these things in many of the same ways that architects do, which
Yeah.
which is really fascinating. So Brick Moon is named after a late 19th century short story by Edward Everett Hale that was published in the Atlantic, and it's sort of the first story, the first science fiction about a space station and about what it's like to live
Okay.
on a space station.
Hmm.
And this is right after the Civil War, and it's a sort of just accidental circumstance that lands these people on this artifact in space, this moon made of brick. But what happens is he goes right to, okay, how they make their own culture up there and how they recognize a sort of a new possible relationship with the cultures that they're leaving behind on Earth. So Brick Moon for us captures a lot of things. It captures the nature of the construct, right? This is the material kind of reality that was built by humans, again,
Right. Right.
um, but it also captures the idea that along with that materiality comes cultural and social concerns that were foregrounded, right back in the 19th century, and that should be, at the forefront of, again, and in those spaces where design decisions are being made about future spaces, the cultural and social concerns should be part of the things that are talked about in those spaces.
Of course. Of course. Super interesting. And like now it goes to obviously the next scale. It almost seems like, yes, individual space habitats are interesting and novel and whatnot, but then it really is like, well, how are you making almost like the space city? How are you urban designing kind of the surrounding aspects? And then also, you mentioned earlier Shannon Mattern. I'm trying to get her on the podcast and scheduling with her is because her
Oh,
book,
perfect.
a
Yeah.
City is Not a Computer,
Yes.
kind of
Mhm.
immediately piqued my interest.